on or anything else? Okay, if not, we're going to go to screen sharing and continue to talk about ecology today. So we were starting to talk about populations yesterday, and we were beginning to discuss their distribution, where they're found in nature. So we said the range is kind of an overall picture of where they're found. If you've ever tried to look up a bird in a field guide or a plant and identify that bird or plant, a lot of field guides give you a picture of the range. So you might have seen this before. But when we're actually looking at how this organism survives in nature, and remember, ecology is the study of organisms and how they interact with their environment. When we want to see how they interact, we need something a little more specific. And what we typically want to study in biology is something called the habitat. And the habitat is the very specific location within their range where organisms live. So it's not just that their range is Illinois, but do they live in fast-moving streams in Illinois? Do they build their nests in tall plants around streams? Do they live in meadows? And when we look at the patterns that we see within a range, the patterns that we see within a range typically depend on the habitats. So we see three different types of patterns. So let's think about these three patterns that we can observe. One of them we've actually already talked a little bit about. We just weren't really referring to habitat at the time. And that's a random distribution. In a random distribution, when we look at organisms in their range, they're just scattered about without any pattern. Sometimes we see individual organisms, sometimes we see groups of organisms. The groups might be small groups, it might be just a pair, it might be a larger group. So the groups aren't necessarily all the same size. In real life, we don't really see random distributions very often. Living organisms aren't just found anywhere in their environment. But random distributions can be useful because if we're trying to do a statistical test and we're trying to see where they're really found in the environment, a random distribution can be a good null hypothesis. Remember when we were working our chi-squared problems a few days ago, in some of those chi-squared problems, we looked at one with frogs being found in several different parts of the environment. And our null hypothesis for that problem was, something to the effect of frogs are found randomly in their environment. So it's a null hypothesis. It's not something we see very often. And that's not surprising. You don't see a random assortment of plants and animals in your front yard or in the park down the street. So there are two patterns that we typically see in nature. One is a pattern that's labeled as nearly uniform. A lot of times it's just referred to as a uniform pattern. And in a uniform or nearly uniform pattern, because no pattern is completely uniform, in a nearly uniform pattern, the organisms that we're looking at are spread out approximately equally throughout their environment. So if you see a certain type of plant, you might take 10 steps and then you see the next plant, and then you take 11 steps and you see the next one, and then you take 10 and you see the next one. So they're spread out very evenly. And we typically see this in a couple of different types of situations. We sometimes see this with plants in very extreme environments, like deserts. And this is because in a desert, by definition, deserts don't receive very much precipitation. So water is in short supply, and plants need water to carry out photosynthesis. So when we look at plants in a desert, if you would look at a typical desert plant, like you probably all seen in some type of movie, a type of plant called tumbleweed. tumbleweed really is a plant. The tumbleweed that's blowing around is dead. But there's something called a creosote bush. There are some trees called juniper trees. There are several different types of plants that are commonly found in deserts. And if we would look at the roots on those, the roots are very different than we see on roots in plants here in Illinois or most environments that aren't a desert, if we want to think of it in a more general term. Now, how are they different? Well, if you think about a root on a plant here in Illinois, we have to think about the climate in Illinois. Even in the summer when it's really hot, if it rains, some of the rain soaks into the soil. And some of that rain that soaks into the soil gets absorbed by the roots of plants. Now, some of it trickles down in the soil until it's so far down it gets beyond the roots. And this forms something that we call groundwater. People who dig wells are really tapping into this groundwater. If it's not pulled up from the earth in a well, eventually this groundwater flows in little cracks between the rocks and the soil, and it gets back to Lake Michigan or the Mississippi River or the Atlantic Ocean, or, depending on where you live. So since water percolates down into the soil here in Illinois, plants tend to have roots that grow downward. But in a desert, at least hot deserts, the temperatures are so high that the water doesn't drip down into the soil very far. A lot of the water evaporates before it gets further than 2 or 3 inches down into the soil. So most plants in the desert don't have roots that go down. They have roots that spread out sideways. And these roots are just a few inches under the soil. So why can't plants live close together? Well, one of the reasons is because if they live too close together, both of the plants die for lack of water. They die of dehydration, basically. So the plants are spread out relatively evenly. There are also some plants like creosote bushes, and creosote bushes in a way are like penicillium mold. We talked about penicillium mold a few weeks ago when we talked about fungi. And we said, why should a mold make something like penicillin that kills other bacteria and fungi? And we said it's really to protect its territory. Creosote bushes make a poison that kills other plants. And what does it do? It stakes out a territory for them so that they control the access to the water in this territory. So if we look at a desert, and keep in mind, deserts don't necessarily, they're not completely barren like we might think from some of the movies. Here's something from the Sonoran Desert in the American Southwest. And these are creosote bushes. And if you look at them, they're spread out pretty evenly. You don't see clumps where they're really close together. You don't see really large gaps. And this is because of the fact that they're, in a sense, divvying up the water that's available. If you get somebody who's selfish and doesn't want to divvy up the water, they want to encroach on your territory, the bad news is both plants will die. So this is something that happens naturally, because if the plants grow too close together, they die. If they're too far apart, another plant will move in the middle to get access to that water that nobody's using. So we sometimes see a uniform distribution. Now, we also see uniform distributions with animals. We're getting to the point now where you can start to hear some of the birds singing outside. And when the birds sing, a lot of those birds are singing to defend their territory. Most birds only defend their territory against other birds of the same species. So if you see a robin in a tree that singing, that robin is telling all the other robins, this is my tree, and not just my tree, but robin's territory includes the lawn around that tree. So they're telling all the other birds, stay out of my yard or I'm going to have to beat you up. And that's why sometimes you see birds chasing each other around. They will defend their territory. But with animals that hold territories, they also tend to be spaced fairly evenly, because most males not being chauvinistic here, it's usually males that hold territories. Most males have territories that are about the same size, although there is some variation because usual territories are for feeding. So if there's more food in one territory, that territory may be smaller. If there's less food, that territory may be larger. And again, there's constant battles. If males are too close together, there's not enough food, they may not be able to rear the hatchlings that hatch from the eggs successfully. They may not be able to find enough food for them. If the territories are too far apart, you'll have other birds kind of move in between the two and try to access some of those resources that aren't being used. So uniform distributions occur, and they're not rare, but they're not the most common distributions. The most common distributions are definitely clumped distributions. And in clumped distributions, we have groups of organisms that are found in the same area. They're not always the same size groups. Some of the groups can be larger, some can be smaller. Obviously, to be a group, we can't have individual organisms, but sometimes we see mating pairs, so just two individuals. Sometimes we see mating pairs with their offspring. Sometimes we see herds of animals, like a herd of zebra, or a pride of lions, or a flock of geese. Those are groups that are found in roughly the same area. They're clumped. Well, why are organisms clumped? For a couple of reasons. If we look at a model of Indiana, I was using channel catfish as an example the other day of something that its range is Illinois, but you don't find any channel catfish in my backyard or front yard. Why? Because my backyard and front yard don't have that much water in them. Channel catfish couldn't live there, and definitely not a large enough group to form a breeding population. But if we look at a map of Indiana, and I live in Illinois, not Indiana, but I like this map better than the one I found of Illinois. This shows the major rivers and streams and lakes in Indiana. And some of these areas are where you would find channel catfish. Now notice all the yellow in between the rivers and lakes and streams, there are no channel catfish in those areas. So channel catfish would be clumped along these areas where there's the blue. Now with fish, it's a pretty obvious example that, different types of fish, or if we were looking at mussels, they live in water, it's a pretty obvious example that things like that are going to be clumped where there's water. But for most living organisms, there are some sort of resources that those organisms depend on that are also clumped. If you would take a walk in Illinois, and if you would go out more towards Western Illinois, where you're in the area that's getting close to the eastern edge of what we sometimes call the Great Plains. If you go out in that area and you would take a walk through a wild area, what you would see is that trees are mostly limited to lower areas. Sometimes they're found along the beds of streams or near lakes. Sometimes they're just found in kind of depressions where the ground dips down. Now, why are trees limited to those areas as we go out towards the west, towards the Great Plains? Because there's more water available in streams and near lakes and in depressions in the ground. Trees need more water than grass does. So grass can grow on the flat, high places in between, places that are relatively dry, but trees are limited by needing more water. If we look at other types of organisms, animals that are in the area may depend on eating certain types of plants or eating certain types of animals. And then their population is really limited to where they can find their prey. So a lot of times if you watch nature specials, they sometimes make it appear that, the lions really control the population of the zebras. But in some ways, it's the reverse. The prey tend to control the population of the predators. So we want to keep in mind that one reason that we see clumped populations is because of clumped resources. Now, there are other reasons why we see clumped populations. Some organisms live in social groups. If we look at a pride of lions is usually a group of sisters, sometimes female cousins, and their cubs, and usually one adult male. Juvenile males are kicked out of the pride, typically when they're about 2 years old. And they wander around in small groups or individually until they can challenge an adult male and take over a pride. But most of the lions in the wild are found in prides, except for these few individuals who are, old enough to get kicked out of the pride, not quite old enough to take over a pride themselves. This is what, the Lion King is really, really, really loosely based on. The Lion King kind of sugarcoats it a little bit, because in nature, when a male lion takes over a pride, the first thing he does is kill all the cubs, because usually females won't mate with a male while they have young cubs, but they seem to have a short memory. As soon as he kills their cubs, they come into heat within a few months. And that might seem like it's bizarre, but keep in mind, what do we know is the goal of living things? Pass down your DNA. Guess what? Those cubs that the lionesses are taking care of are not your cubs. So if you kill them, it's no sweat off your back. And then you can impregnate the lionesses, and now the new cubs will carry your DNA. So we could have social groups. Now, social groups can be much bigger than a pride. You can have herds of zebra. You can have, if you read about the American West, there are descriptions of herds of buffalo, stretching from literally one horizon to the other horizon. Millions of individuals in a single group. And you can have all sorts of sizes in between. I'm sure you've all seen some videos of a school of a few thousand fish swimming and seemingly all turning as one and pivoting in the same direction. So sometimes we have animals that are clumped, not because of their resources, but because they live in social groups. And it could be both. Keep in mind, it doesn't have to be one or the other. It could be both. And when we talk about social groups, keep in mind, even some animals that are solitary come together for at least a short period of time and mate. So some animals like tigers are solitary, but at the right time of the year, you might find them in pairs. So for mating in social groups or to use clumped resources, these are all reasons why you might have a clumped population. And as I say, more than one can apply to the same organisms that we're studying. Now, although distribution can be important, when we look at populations, what we're usually interested in is population numbers. And not just what the number in the population is right now, but how is the number changing? Is this population increasing in size? Is it decreasing? Is the population staying about the same size? So here's an example of a social group, hyenas. When we look at living organisms, and if we just measure how many, say, hyenas we have, one of the things we can do is we can calculate the population density. And the population density is calculated just by dividing the number of hyenas or zebras or flamingos or whatever we're studying by the area that they live in. Now, there's two ways that we can do this. We can count the number of hyenas and we can divide by the area of their range. The problem with counting the number of hyenas and dividing by the area of their range goes back to the problem with the range that we talked about earlier. If we think about our channel catfish. If we have a fish and this fish is limited to Indiana, we could count the number of fish or estimate it. We probably couldn't count every fish, but we could count the number of fish and we could divide by the area of Indiana. And then we could say there are 11 fish per square mile or whatever our results came out to. The problem is this is a very deceptive way of looking at population density. I mean, it might be accurate in the sense that it's true, on average, there are 11 of these fish every square mile of Indiana. But it's deceptive because these fish are only found in water. So this really is an underestimation of their true density in the sense that really the only part of Indiana that's relevant is the water where these fish live. So if we want to find the population density, it would really be much better if we would count the number of fish, but instead of dividing by the total area of Indiana, divide by the total area of the water in Indiana, since that's the only place where they live. And if you look and, just guesstimate how much of this map of Indiana is blue, the waterways, versus how much is yellow, land, I don't know what, maybe 5% of Indiana is water and 95% is land. I'm not sure. But if you think about that, if only 5% of Indiana is water, that means if you divided by the water instead of the total area, you'd get a result. You'd get a population density that was 20 times higher. So when we look at the population density, if we're just dividing by the total area of the range, then this is sometimes called the crude density. And whenever in math, whenever we call something crude, well, really not math, but in sciences, when we call something crude, it doesn't mean somebody who's obnoxious or however you think of crude as being, it means it's a bad estimate. So the crude density is a bad estimate because we're thinking of all the land in Indiana while we're talking about a fish. So when we look at the crude density, it's pretty much always going to be an underestimate of the actual population density. So what we're more interested in usually is the ecological density. And in the ecological density, we're going to still count our number of fish or whatever we're talking about, but we're going to divide it by the area of the habitats that our organisms live in. And since this habitat probably is not the entire state of Indiana or whatever we're looking at, we're going to be dividing by a smaller number, which means our dividend, our answer, will be a larger number. So we want to keep that in mind. It's very important when we're thinking about living organisms and where they live to keep our focus more on the habitat than the range, because in several ways, the range can be misleading. We mentioned earlier, you may not even be able to find them. Now we're seeing that you may overestimate the population density. So now let's think about demography. And demography is actually the study of the human population. And compared to almost everything else that we will talk about in ecology, demography is very different. When we look at demography, demography was first studied in terms of the human population. And then after it was studied with regard to people, biologists realized that what they were studying also applied to other animals and even to plants and to other types of living organisms. And this is different because almost everything else that has been studied in ecology was first studied in other organisms. And then after a while, biologists figured out, oh, it also applies to people. So in a sense, demography started backwards. And actually demography started with one of the people who gave Darwin some of his inspiration for his ideas about evolution. The Reverend Thomas Malthus in the early 1800s wrote about overpopulation in humans. And he wasn't really worried about, problems that we might think about in connection with overpopulation today. He was the Reverend Thomas Malthus. And what he was worried about was as the population increased, people seemed to treat each other worse. So he was worried that a large population was making people morally bad. So he was really the first one who started studying populations. And he really started studying them to make a religious point or an ethical point, depending on how you look at it, I suppose. So demography is unique in the sense that it was first studied in regards to people. So we will talk about some examples with humans, more than we have maybe with some of our other topics. But we do want to keep in mind that the ideas we're talking about do apply to other organisms. So first of all, let's think about what biologists see when they study populations in nature. And most populations in nature are relatively small. And at least without human influence, they're relatively stable. The numbers don't tend to increase a lot. They don't tend to decrease a lot. Now, how small is small? Less than 10,000 individuals. And 10,000 sounds like a lot, but if you're talking about something, say, the size of a housefly or an ant, that's a small group. Now, why are populations that are small important? Well, remember back when we talked about evolution, in small populations, genetic drift can be important. So a lot of populations in nature are small enough that genetic drift has an impact on their characteristics, on their genetics. So let's start out and think about a population under ideal circumstances. And we're going to look at a lot of graphs that will graph time on the x-axis. So the beginning of our study is on the left where, the two axes intersect. And then as time progresses, we go off to the right. And then a lot of the graphs that we're going to look at with populations, the number of individuals in the population is on the y-axis. So larger numbers are higher, smaller numbers are lower. And if we have ideal conditions, so ideal conditions, we have a population and let's say it moves to an area where it hasn't been before. So there's a new source of food. Maybe there are no predators in the area. But when we look at populations under this sort of circumstance, this is the basic shape of the curve that we see. And for obvious reasons, this is sometimes called a J-shaped curve. It's also called an exponential population growth curve. And it's called an exponential population growth curve because if we write an equation describing this graph, this graph should look vaguely familiar to you. It kind of looks like half of a parabola. And remember, a parabola that was something like this, the equation for this would be something like y equals x squared. So y, where y is the population number, equals x squared, where x is the time. So notice x squared has an exponent. So this is also called an exponential population growth curve. And in an exponential population growth curve, the increase gets greater and greater and greater for the same unit of time. And when we say the increase gets greater, that means the slope of this curve increases. So this becomes more and more like a vertical curve. Now, if we just want to know about the increase in the population, the increase is equal to something called R, the rate of increase. And the rate of increase is equal to B minus D, the number of births, or I should say the birth rate, sorry, minus the death rate. And we're going to multiply R times N, the number in the population right now. So if we want to find out the increase in the population, we need to know the number in the population right now. We need to know the birth rate, and we need to know the death rate. Now notice with animals, it's much easier to measure birth rate and death rate accurately than it is with people, just from the point of view that with people, there can be something like COVID-19, which increases the death rate. There can be a new medical technology that's developed, like artificial hearts, that lowers the death rate. There are also with people cultural effects. Today, a lot of women postpone having children or don't have children at all. Why? Well, they want to pursue a career. They want to have more free time. They want to have more money. You know, if we're looking at, you know, snakes, or we're looking at oak trees, or we're looking at penicillin fungus, they're not going to decide not to produce offspring so that they can have a career. So with animals, the birth rate tends to be, and not just animals, I should say plants, bacteria, fungi, the reproductive rate tends to be much more stable. Now, the problem with this exponential growth curve is populations can't continue growing indefinitely. Ultimately, you know, they're going to think about Darwin again. Ultimately, they're going to run into some scarce resources. Maybe there's not enough food to go around. Maybe if the population increases, predators notice them more easily. Maybe they start poisoning themselves with their own waste products. So we'll look at that in a moment, but for now, what we want to keep in mind is something called the rule of 69. Now, a lot of times the rule of 69 is kind of simplified and it's changed to the rule of 70 or 72. We're going to use the rule of 69 because it's actually more mathematically accurate. And the big advantage of the rule of 69 is we can use this and we can calculate something called the doubling time for a population. How long it will take for this population to increase in size until it's double the size that it was originally. Now notice, this rule doesn't only apply to population size. You could also apply the rule of 69 to money that you have in the bank if you want to find out how long it's going to take that amount of money to double. So can be used for factors. Now the key is what we need to find is we need to find the growth rate. And we want to express the growth rate as a percent. We can use decimals. We don't use decimals. That's not crucial. So if we have a population and the growth rate is 3% per year, the way that we calculate the doubling time is we take 69 divided by 3. Notice if we convert our birth rate or our growth rate to percentage, we don't have to worry about decimals. So we're going to take 69 and divide by 3. So the doubling time is 23 years. Notice if we're looking at a population that has a negative growth rate, we obviously can't calculate the doubling time, because if you think about it, a negative growth rate, if the growth rate is minus 2%, a minus 2% growth rate means the population is getting 2% smaller each year. So it's not going to double at all. If we have a growth rate of 5%, we can take 69 and divide by 5, and we get 13.8 weeks. Now notice, in this case, the growth rate is 5% per week. So the units of time that we have dependent on the units of time that are in our measurement of the growth rate. Now, why do we want different measurements of time? Well, because if we're looking at something like say, the mosquito population during the summer, we probably want to look at the growth rate per week. We don't want to look at the growth rate per year because mosquitoes only live a few weeks. So the growth rate per year is really kind of meaningless. We could look at the growth rate per decade if we wanted. We could look at the growth rate per century. We could look at the growth rate per hour, per day. It really depends on how quickly the organism that we're studying reproduces and how long this organism's lifespan is. So we kind of have to pick a time frame that's appropriate. So at some point, finite resources are going to stop this population from growing. So notice, even though we might be studying a population now and we might estimate that the doubling time is 23 years, that doesn't mean necessarily that the population will ever double. Before we get to 23 years, something might happen. So we might never reach that point. Now, one of the things that affects whether we reach that point is something called the carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity is abbreviated K. We have something else in ecology that we use C for. So C was taken. And the carrying capacity is the maximum size of the population of some type of organism. We have to be talking about the carrying capacity for people or for mosquitoes or for black oak trees. Carrying capacity is not a generic concept. So the carrying capacity is the maximum size of the population that the environment can support for a long period of time. How long? Well, theoretically, forever. Now notice, from a practical standpoint, guess what? You can't do an experiment and see what the carrying capacity is forever. You'll never finish that experiment. So because of this, among some other reasons, the carrying capacity is very difficult to measure. In fact, the carrying capacity is the hardest concept in ecology that to measure. Because if you study something for 2 years, there's a problem. When we look at a population can exceed the carrying capacity for a short period of time. And the example I give is, you can spend more money than you make for a short period of time. But at some point, those credit card bills start coming due, your creditors start harassing you, you can't continue to do this forever. So you might have an environment that can support a population of 100 elk. The population of elk may go up to 120, but if the population goes up too high, what happens? These elk start eating most of the plants that support their population, and ultimately the population is going to crash. Maybe it's going to drop to 70 or 80. Because why? We have a bunch of elk that are malnourished. They probably got some food, but we have 120 elk splitting enough food for 100 elk. So they're slightly malnourished. They may starve. They may be too malnourished to reproduce. There are a couple of things that could potentially happen. Now, part of the problem is how long is this short period of time when we say that a population can exceed the carrying capacity for a short period of time? We don't know. It depends on the type of organism. It's hard to tell. We'll talk more later, but some people think that humans have now exceeded the carrying capacity of the earth for humans. And that, we're in a temporary phase where we're above the carrying capacity. But at some point, there will be something that happens that decreases the population size. So the carrying capacity is very difficult to measure accurately. So let's think about what happens to our population as time goes by. Now, one of the things that can happen to our population, just focus on kind of the left half of this red curve for a moment, And notice the left half of this red curve is very similar to that exponential growth curve that we looked at a while ago. It's basically J-shaped. But what happens in mathematics, there's something in towards the middle of this upward region here called an inflection point. And this curve, the growth rate begins to slow down. Now notice there's a number on this graph, the carrying capacity. Keep in mind, we don't necessarily know what that carrying capacity is. We may be able to estimate it, but we don't really have a firm measure. We would kind of fill in the carrying capacity on a graph like this after the fact, after we see the shape of the curve. Now this is what's called a logistic growth curve, or again, for kind of an obvious reason, it's sometimes called an S-shaped curve or a sigmoid curve. Sigma is the Greek letter for S. When we look at this, what we see is that the population size very gradually approaches the carrying capacity. Doesn't mean it won't go slightly over the carrying capacity, but it approaches the carrying capacity relatively slowly. We often see a curve like this in animals or plants that live very long lives, that have a relatively low reproductive rate. Because if you live a long time, if you have a low reproductive rate, then that means that the population is only going to go up very slightly over time. And when you start getting close to the carrying capacity, again, what happens? Resources become scarcer. They become harder to obtain. So that slows population growth even more. So notice the curve kind of flattens out. So with some organisms, we see a logistic curve, or if you prefer, S-shaped or sigmoid. A second possibility is we see a population that shows an oscillating curve. Notice again, the carrying capacity is shown on this graph, and it's not something we measure. It's something that we kind of infer by looking at the population numbers over time. And in a population curve like this, we'll come back to what these different phases are in a moment. In a population growth curve like this, the population goes slightly above the carrying capacity, then it dips slightly below, then a little bit above, then a little bit below. Now notice this is the exact same type of graph that we would see in your house if we looked at the graph of the temperature, say in the winter when you had the heat turned on, but also in the summer when you had the air conditioning turned on. So what happens? Let's think about this in terms of temperature first. So you turn on your furnace, let's say you have the thermostat set for 70 degrees. When you have the thermostat set for 70 degrees, the temperature in your house usually goes up to 71 or 72 or maybe 70.5 degrees. It depends on how sensitive the thermostat is. Now, when the temperature gets slightly above the setting, what happens? The thermostat turns your furnace off. So when the furnace gets turned off, the temperature starts to drop. And now the temperature gets slightly below the setting on the thermostat. So if the thermostat is set at 70, the temperature in your house drops to 69, 68, maybe 67. But at some point, the thermostat senses that the temperature is too low and it kicks the furnace on again. So with a population, what we see, there's no sensor like a thermostat, but a population overshoots the carrying capacity slightly. When it does, resources are in short supply. Maybe there's not enough food to go around. Maybe there's not enough mates to find to mate with somebody. Maybe there aren't enough hiding places to find to hide from predators. So what happens? Reproductive rate may decrease. Death rate may increase. So the population goes down a little bit. When the population goes down a little bit and it's below the carrying capacity, now all of a sudden, there's plenty of places to hide from predators. It's easy to find mates. There's lots of food to go around. So birth rate increases, death rate decreases. So the population goes up a little bit. So we see these kind of fluctuations, and these can occur over a long period of time. And it's hard to tell from this graph, but notice that the fluctuations aren't necessarily exactly the same size. They can vary. Sometimes they're a little bit bigger, sometimes they're a little bit smaller. And actually, when we're studying populations, these different stages of the graph that are shown in different colors have different names. The lag phase is the phase at the beginning where you don't really see much population growth. Then we have the exponential growth phase where the growth is very noticeable and very steady. Then we have the transitional phase when we're kind of moving from the exponential growth phase to the last stage, which is sometimes called the plateau or stabilizing or oscillating phase. So here it's a matter of we get slightly above the carrying capacity, resources are scarce. We get slightly below, they're not as scarce. So this allows the population to increase when we're below the carrying capacity. It forces the population to decrease when we're above. And then a third possibility is something like we see with snowshoe hares and lynxes. And lynxes are cats. One of the main things they feed on is snowshoe hares. And if we look at population sizes from the 1800s, and the reason we have such accurate population sizes for so many years is if we go back to the 1800s, snowshoe hare fur was used to make clothing, and so was lynx fur. So they were actually trapped on a consistent basis from the early 1800s to the early 1900s. Now, notice there's no carrying capacity shown on this chart. We might be able to do it, but it would be much more of a guess. And the reason it's much more of a guess, let's look first at the snowshoe hare population graph. Now notice there are two scales. So for the snowshoe hare, we're talking about somewhere between roughly 40,000 and 160,000 individuals in the population. For the lynx population, we're talking about somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 lynxes. And this shouldn't be surprising. Notice the predator population is smaller than the prey population. Remember, these are both mammals. And what do we know about mammals? They're endothermic and homeothermic. So they both have relatively high body temperatures. So it takes a lot of snowshoe hares to feed a lynx to keep it alive for a year. So the population of predators should be smaller. But in terms of the population curve, notice that there are really big swings in the population size. This is especially noticeable for the snowshoe hare. Notice, if you think about it, the population swings for the lynx are just as drastic. It's not as obvious because there aren't as many lynxes. But if you look, the population gets as high as about 6,000. Sometimes it drops to, it looks like maybe 1,000. So, big differences. Now, you might think this is an oscillating curve, but the big difference is the swings are much greater. And because the swings are much greater in population size, it's very difficult to even make a guesstimate of what the carrying capacity might be. Now, notice also this graph is a good example of something that we talked about a few moments ago. For many years, biologists were convinced that the lynx population exerted a control on the size of the snowshoe hare population. But then when they started looking at this more carefully, what they realized was, think about this big peak for the snowshoe hares. Notice the nearest peak for the lynxes is a little bit after that. It's hard to tell by this graph, but maybe a year or two. So guess what? The snowshoe hare population is really exerting a control on the lynx population. When there are a lot of snowshoe hares, there's a lot of food for the lynxes, so their population increases after that time. So this is a little backwards to what, at least for most biologists, their common sense told them initially. Maybe it's because we eat meat, we assume that predators are the dominant force controlling their environment. But it looks like in many cases, prey may be even more important. Are there any questions before we stop for today about the different types of population curves that we've seen? No? Okay, I will stop sharing. And if you have any other questions, we will take them now, but if not, you're free to go until tomorrow. Tomorrow, it would be good to make sure you have access to a calculator. You know, we're doing things with graphs, so you might be able to guess. Ultimately, we're going to play with some numbers ourselves. Don't forget, there's a vocabulary matching set that's due this evening. So make sure you don't forget about that. And if you don't have any questions, I will see you tomorrow.
Okay, see you tomorrow.
So long, Nick.
Have a good day.
You too.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Bye.